lot of repetition. Vayi hamabul. Abayim yom al oretz. Vayi hamabul vov hey. Al oretz vayirbu amayim. Vov hey vayirbu amayim. Al oretz vayirbu. Vov hey. Vayisu es hateva. Vov hey. Hateva vatorom. It was raised up. Me'al ha'oretz vayigberu. Ha'oretz vayigberu. Hey vov. Vayigberu amayim. Vov hey. First two letters. Hamayim vayirbu. They multiplied. Mo'id al oretz. Vatelech hateva. Vov hey. Al panei hamayim vehamayim. Vov hey. Vayichutzu kol hehorim. Hagevoyim asher tachas. Hagevoyim asher is vov. Hey aleph. Hagevoyim asher. Hey horim, hey vov, and this is perhaps describing the process whereby the teva was 40 days in the water, and the waters raised it out of the water, and the waters were extremely strong, and therefore the teva had to also be able to float. And Rashi tells us the calculation that the teva was 30 amos high and was suspended in the water. How much? 11 amos. This is maybe what's being referred to. Maybe that's part of the miracle that it wasn't submerged further. Well, the waters did come up to 11 amos, and we explained what the significance of that perhaps was. And this is the Vav Hey the whole time. V'hiya Mabu, that it also encroached upon Noach maybe up to 11 amos. This is the significance of all these Vav Hey when describing the intensity of the waters. And it says, Vayimach es kol yekum, Vayimochu min ha'oretz, Vayishoer ach Noach v'asher itoi b'teva. Everything was obliterated from the world. Vayimochu, all species, everything. Vayishoer, and only Noach remained. V'asher itoi b'teva, and those who were with him in the teva. And perhaps also figuratively, Noach again is coming to exert his influential influence spiritually on the occupants of the teva, and he is perhaps coming to perhaps to fortify the influence of shame, the tzaddik, and to negate the possibility of the pernicious influences of chom. Maybe this is vayimach, is chom. Hold on, vayimochu is to counter the influence of chom. Vayishoer ach noach v'asher itoi b'teva, and maybe in that vein, Vayishoer is ach only Noach. So we know Noach was mauled by the lion. There's a reference to that for having delayed procuring its supplies. Vayishoer is very close to the word Yisrael. Ach Noach. You take the ach is 21 plus the ches. Noach is 29 plus another aleph is 30. So you got Yisrael there. It's very closely alluded to. So maybe Yisrael and Noach. And maybe because they were united, perhaps there was a common factor. It says, "Vayiskor Elokim, vayigberu amayim, chamishim u'ma'as yoyim." And then Vayiskor, Hashem remembered. And what's the chamishim u'ma'as yoyim? And then Hashem remembers. What's the connection? Then Hashem remembers Noach. And perhaps, and Rashi tells us that what did he remember? Hashem remembered the righteous ways of Noach and of the animals, that they had not perverted their ways while prior to the flood, and they had also refrained from marital relations in the teva. This maybe imply that in actual fact they were not separated one from another, and nevertheless they had maintained separation. And this perhaps is not just really remembering the animals, but what was this due to? This is due again to the overwhelming inspirational influence of Noach, that he himself was so completely pure under these circumstances that even the animals did not even contemplate doing what would come most natural to them. There have been studies recently under the regime of lockdowns, etc., where people are contained in enclosed environments, and there is far greater incidence of promiscuity and predators and of and harassment and of whatever improper relations that will result inevitably for those who are not careful under these circumstances, under such a regime. And therefore it was to their credit that they were able to maintain such spiritual asceticism and purity under such circumstances. Therefore Hashem remembered after 150 days that they had sort of, so to speak, been confined and nevertheless had remained faithful to those precepts. This argued well that they would rebuild a new world founded on the appropriate principles. Therefore Hashem remembered them. 150 perhaps is significant. That's Kufnun, the Kinim, the wall, the rooms. The ark was commanded to be built from rooms, and maybe rooms would mean physically separation, but also perhaps it would mean the separation again would result through the emanation of the example, a prime example of Noach himself. He would create the virtual rooms, the virtual separators between the species one another and between even the spouses within each species. That is the kinim. That was the obligation to Noach, to ensure that separation is maintained through Noach's prime spiritual example that Hashem noted after 150 days, the remes to the 150 days of separation which they had endured. And that's maybe it says Vayisgoyer Hashem ba'adoy. Hashem closed the ark on Noach, and it says Mikol va'boim zochor nekeva, they came male and female as Hashem had commanded. Vayisgoyer Hashem ba'adoy. And what does it mean? What is the connection? Perhaps it's saying that they came male and female as Hashem had commanded Noach. What do you mean Hashem had commanded Noach that they should come male and female? How is that a command to Noach? And that's an inspiration perhaps to the animals themselves. But we explained that this is an actual fact part of the injunction on Noach, that he would be the inspiration that would influence, cause the animals themselves to migrate towards Noach to be saved. That he represented the high ground that would be for them the salvation, even though it was destined to be under circumstances of separation, and even though they were nevertheless prepared to come male and female. This required from Noach an even greater exertions on creating facilities that would be amenable to these animals, that would be prepared to undergo these circumstances for such a long time. This required from Noach all the spiritual and logistical energies he could muster to tend to the material needs of the animals and preserve their spiritual integrity. And maybe this Vayisgoyer, where else does it say? It says Vayisgoyer Hashem, Hashem closed. Where else does it say Vayisgoyer? It says by Chava, Vayisgoyer Hashem ba'adoy. And we explained last week that Das Canaan brings, it's the only place it says Samach. And we explained that perhaps Hashem was also dealing with the over attraction, improper attraction, male to female. Hashem was trying to ameliorate it. Therefore, Vayisgoyer Hashem, Das Kenny points out, is the only place where you have a samach, and we explained this is perhaps why the world is circular. You can listen to it there, but it's to do with the tremendous attraction that existed. Hashem sort of created a counter. Vayisgoyer, he closed it up. He could close the female to make her to a certain extent as inaccessible as possible. This would act as a protective layer from the marauding and predator males who otherwise would indulge their improper passions. Therefore Hashem required Hashem's separating efforts. And this is Vayisgoyer here. Hashem also closed the ark. The closing was not just a physical closure and waterproofing and ensuring that everything was watertight, but rather it was enabling that the animal, everything would be prepared to remain intact in the Oroin, in the Teva, under a spiritual regime of holiness, of separation, of modesty, etc. And this was the divine help in this. And this was the whole mission of Noach, to counter any other undue, inappropriate influences. That's Vayimochu. He was countering Chum, who would be exerting his inappropriate influence. And the Ovois, Avram was married to Sarah perhaps at a young age. Yitzchak, when he was 40, Yaakov married the latest. He was, by my reckoning, I have to check it out, when he first got married, he was 84. He was 63 at the incidence of the brachas. He was 14 years in Shem Ve'ev, which makes him 77. Therefore, he was 84 after 7 years of working for Rachel and Leah. And Yaakov tells Reuven that he preserved complete spiritual purity And perhaps he took this to a certain extent from Noach, that Reuven Becheri at the Keichiv Reishis Oini, that Yaakov, Rashi says, Loiro Keri, he never had an alternate emission during his whole life. He was so completely pure during his whole 84 years. Was so pure Yaakov. And maybe this was what Noach was inculcating the spirit into the world at that time. And Vayishor maybe is a remez to Yisrael. We suggested Vayishor Ach Noach. Noach and Yisrael. Yaakov was the one that would be here being influenced. Ach Noach va'asher. So if we take the Ach, you got Noach, and the Ach is 21. Va'asher, the first two letters is Vav Aleph, which is 7. And 7, 21. So if you take 21 and multiply by 7, you get 147. 147 are the years of Yaakov. So maybe this is also another reference to Yaakov. And why is times 7? Because the Rosh told us at the beginning of the parasha that all the tzaddikim who are described as Tomim are lived in multiples of 7. And Yaakov is called Ish Tom, so one presumes it refers to Yaakov. And Yaakov is 21 times 7. 147. And therefore maybe here there's a remez to Yaakov. Vayishor Ach Noach Va'asher is referring to Yaakov. And how old, we said, how long did Yaakov, how did this spiritual purity express itself? He went 84 years without any spiritual impure thoughts whatsoever. And if you take Noach is 58 plus 20 is 78 plus 6 Va'asher is 84. Which maybe is another allusion to those 84 years that are the expression of the spiritual purity of Yaakov as well. And here's one from left field that says that the ark landed on the 17th of the 7th month. If that's there's a machlokes when it's calculated, the 7th is Tammuz. Here or Al Hori Ararot. Anyway, Ararot actually happens to spell, to allude to, suggested Hari Orarot. Ararot is Ararot is maybe an allusion. First of all, it's an impure non-Jewish word, which I'm not even going to articulate here. But maybe this is coming to counter to what we're suggesting. Ararot, Hari Orarot is etrog. Aleph, Reish is Aleph Tov, then the Reish of Horei, and Tes is Vav Gimel. So you got a remez maybe to Esrog. So what's Esrog got to do with it? You know, where are you coming from? And if we took the Reish of Horei, so what's left is Yud Hey, which is 15th. What's Esrog got to do with the 15th of Shvat? Now if we take the Reish of Horei and Aleph Lam Ein Lamed gives us Shin, which is Shvat, and Vav Hey of Vehamayim, the next word is 11, which is Shvat. Seems we have the words Esrog 15th of Shvat. Merum is here, which maybe is again that this is perhaps the opportunity that Esrog is the fruit that is of the 4 species represents the righteous one that maintains to a certain extent separation. Isolationism. It is not held together, it's not bound together with the other 3 species. And maybe this is a continuing theme here, that Noach maintains additional time in the ark to maintain his separation from the world. It says, V'Noach at the beginning, V'Noach ben 600 shana. Noach was 600 and the flood was water under the land. And what's this adding again? What's the connection? We know he was 600 years old. What's the connection? And then it says, Noach came and his children, his sons and his wife and their wives, they joined him in the Teva. So Rashi explains that Noach also, and certainly his wife and children, were somewhat disbelieving. They did not enter the Teva, it seems, till they were absolutely forced. Maybe we can say an allusion, this Sheishmi Yishana, that events, the flood actually started perhaps. I don't know at what point did the animals come in, we have to know. Was it before, after, once the flood had started, or were they already entrenched inside? But Noach himself was disbelieving. But maybe it says a number of times Sheishmi, maybe it's an illusion that that is what in some ways perhaps empowered Hashem. This was the contrast. That Hashem was, and many people, the Zoya says, Me'avor me Noach, Hashem promises that no longer will the floods of Noach be brought, or will flood the world. Why they called me Noach? The flood waters of Noach, the flood waters of Hashem, in which Noach was saved. And before she bring from the Zoya that in some ways the flood waters are attributed to Noach himself. He was in some ways responsible. Maybe he had not promised, he had not sufficiently prayed on behalf of his generation, or perhaps even his righteousness in some ways brought about the flood, because there was a contrast that Noach on one hand is righteous and you in this generation are not performing as you should, and look, you have an example from Noach to follow and you're failing to follow it, therefore you are all the more guilty. Whatever the reason might be, there's some attribution of guilt to Noach himself. Maybe Sheish is a remez to this contrast. On one hand, Noach is being saved, and on the other hand, the Noach is coming, the Mabul is coming to the world. And Sheish is also Lashon Sos, maybe. It says a number of times. Maybe here we can darshan it. Sos, a remez we can't darshan, but a remez, Kasher Sos Hashem Aleichem, like Hashem delights to perform to you good on your behalf. Ken Yosis, Hashem also will delight in Lavidechem Lashmid, to destroy you. And maybe this is not just something. This is said in the Teichacho, in the portions reprimanding Yisrael in anticipation of if they will go astray, that Hashem will delight, as He has delighted in favoring them, and He will also delight in punishing them. And maybe this dynamic is not something that was initiated for Yisrael, but maybe it's something that already exists in the world. Maybe from the time of Noach, that the way Hashem, the extent to which Hashem delighted in providing for the world, that at the time of the Mabul, there was everything was before that. Everything had been offered in great supply. Similarly with Sodom and Amorah, they were given all good of the world, and in the same measure, Hashem also delighted in punishing them. And or maybe also the flip side of this, Hashem would delight, so to speak, in Hashem was able to bring punishment to the world, which is not something that, so to speak, Hashem would contemplate or consider or wish in any way whatsoever to do. And this will provide also an inspiration for an example, a pernicious example for humanity. But at the same time, if Hashem is engaged in miraculously, benevolently saving Noach, then this acts as a counter, and therefore Noach again is in some ways enabler of the Mabul to come about. He's allowing Hashem to nevertheless maintain His merciful hanhogo mode of conduct regarding the world. And then maybe this is the Sheish Mi'Hishono, that Hashem is enabling Hashem to delight in performing good on behalf of the tzaddik. At the same time, it says, Hashem will rejoice over you and will make others rejoice over inflicting harm upon you, to destroy you, and you'll be raised up over the land. And that's the Mabul. Maybe where does that come from? Where was the first time that you will be raised up? This was Noach perhaps, and humanity. The flood waters, they themselves perhaps all ascended to higher ground or were raised already by the flood waters. From Abul Hoyo is again 11, perhaps an allusion to the 11 Amos which the ark was steeped in the waters, and therefore the waters had to rise 11 Amos before the Oren itself would leave the ground. That's Vamabul Hoyo, that's Vavhe, 11 Amos, Mayim, V'nisachtem mi'alo adomo, we raised off the ground. This was maybe, that's when the Teva became raised off the ground, when it reached 11. That's Vamabul Hoyo Mayim, that's Vavhe Mem, V'nisachtem mi'alo adomo, be raised up off the ground. In which case, maybe this was the point at which Noach, till now he was perhaps in disbelief and incredulous, perhaps that there will not be a flood that will require us to take leave of the world, and maybe Noach hoped that his presence in the world would somehow cause the decree to be nullified. However, when he saw that the flood waters were rising He had no choice but to embark upon in the teva. And at what point was this? Maybe when they reached this critical level of 11 amas high, and at that point the teva would start to leave the ground. And how much of the teva was left uncovered in which he could actually enter the teva? He saw there was only 19 amas left. It's 30 amas high. So there's only 19 amas visible of the teva. At that point he came in. Vayovoi, he entered the teva. Vayovoi is 19. Vayovoi 13 plus 16 plus 3 is 19. So the 19 amas that remained forced Noach to have to embark on the teva. Ubonov ishtoi and shevonov itoi. Similarly, ubonov vov ishtoi vov 12 uneshebonov is 18. Itoi is 1. 3, 6 is 18, 19. His wife and children also at that point, when there was only 19 amas of the teva above the water level, they were at that point forced to enter into the teva mipnei mehamabul. But we want to come back to the pure animals that Noach immediately offered up as sacrifices upon exiting the teva. And we asked and we suggested perhaps a couple of rationales, but we're going to suggest now, looking at the subsequent portion, another perhaps rationale that says that after Noach had exited the teva and he offered up the sacrifices, and Hashem gave them a blessing, and he told them to be fruitful and multiply, and he says, and your fear shall be on all of wildlife, on all forms of life, and on all fowl, anything that inhabits the world. You should maintain your control and authority, perhaps your spiritual authority. You will be the prime spiritual example, inspiring the world to proper conduct. It says, and Noach here is granted, is granted the right to partake of meat. Like initially Adam was granted the right to eat all vegetation, but not meat. Here you have been given the right to meat. And before Hashem asked, why is it that at this point Noach was given entitlement to consume animal flesh? And I think I was once told by my friend Yitzhak Newman, this foreigner says that after the Mabul, that nature itself had become depleted to a certain extent through the movements of the sun and the celestial bodies, etc. And the whole world perhaps was no longer as nourished and strong as had been previously, and therefore perhaps man required, there was not sufficient nutrients available through just consuming vegetable, vegan diet, and therefore there was a necessity to consume flesh. Therefore that was why permission was granted. I suggest another rationale would be that now truly all of animal life owed its existence, its very existence, to Noach, in which case man was the genuine true ruler of all animal life, in which case that is what served to grant man the moral right now to consume animal flesh. We're going to suggest another rationale. Pasuk carries on. You may consume animal flesh, but you should not consume it while it is alive. This refers to Eva min achai, that as long as it's live, or the Targum says even after shchita, maybe while it's still alive, you're not permitted to eat it. And then what's the next verse? We have to see this in context, like the Malach. Interesting, a very dramatic verse. And even your blood, for your own life, I will demand. Miyad kol chayo edroshenu, I will demand this of any creature. Umiyad ha'odam, and from the hand of man, any drishas nefesh ha'odam, I will seek the life of man. Sheifeich dam ha'odam, whoever will spill the blood of man, his blood will also be spilled by man. And they explain what are these psukim saying? That first of all, it's an azhara, a warning against taking one's own life. That achas dim chel nafshei sechem edroish, you may not take your own life. That's one. Hashem is sort of bolstering the stature and the status and the image of man, such that, first of all, you cannot take your own life. It's not yours, maybe it's God's life, it's God given, maybe that's what it's saying. And not just that, if any animal, any predator is to take the life of man, then Hashem will seek revenge of that. Because, and Rashi says this was in response to the fact that previously, at the time of the Mabul, the flood, the generation had so descended and degenerated their conduct such that it was decreed that the animals themselves would be permitted to take the lives of people. There was no longer the fear of man on the animal kingdom because they had sinned. Therefore Hashem is now restoring this innate fear that animals have from human beings, perhaps because again Noach was the source of survival of the animals. And further than that, and more than that, if any human being is to take another life, then Hashem will exact justice. Either or man himself is required to exact full justice, to take the life. If there are witnesses, then we have to avenge the death through taking the life of the perpetrator of this. And what's all this saying? And why is this coming in the context of so one can see a loose connection in telling man to be fruitful. Part of being fruitful also is not taking the life of other people, and not taking your own life. That also prejudices the ability of man to be fruitful. We can suggest that, like, from this perspective, what it's saying is that the primary injunction is perhaps, yes, the life of man is extremely important. Maybe Hashem is saying, since I have callously annihilated billions of human beings, therefore life is no longer sacrosanct, and therefore this has to be, this covenant with man, the sanctity of life, has to be renewed, refortified. Therefore all the injunctions against taking life have to be strengthened. Perhaps, but we can also suggest that this is also part of the primary theme that we've been suggesting. That it's about the tzaddik, that Noach in the Teva, Hashem is enabling through Noach the rebuilding of a new spiritually inspired world under the influence of Noach. He is the banner of human morality from now on. And Hashem therefore says, in the interest of this, you should be fruitful and multiply, that you should be the dominant tone in this world, because we have now derived the world from a righteous source, all emanating from Noach. Therefore, if man is able to exert his influence over the world, this will preserve, and not the opposite, this will preserve the moral integrity of the world. Not that the animal kingdom will, so to speak, the animalistic instincts will overpower man. On the contrary, man himself will be the spiritual keeper of the world. And perhaps that is the reason why permission is given that now man is accorded the right to eat, to partake of animals. Perhaps in this interest, man is accorded now the right to consume animal flesh. As I once saw an article, I think it was an Ami, about some employer who was discussing his success as an entrepreneur, and also discussing his approach to discipline within the workplace, to ensuring that all his workers were compliant with the wishes of the company. He said he has a rule, golden rule, that he always dismisses one employer a week, one employee a week, something like that. That's the way he ensures workers are disciplined. He has to find someone that has to be dismissed on a regular basis. And maybe this is borrowing that notion. This is what it's saying. This is how man will maintain his control over the animal kingdom, will exert his influence. The proper influence that Hashem says, this is the proper hierarchy. And man is at the top of the stature and the status within this world, inspiring it and influencing it, and therefore towards that end, Hashem says, now I'm giving you even greater control and influence over the animals, that you're allowed to actually take their life to consume it. And that represents a superior, elevated status. You can thereby exert additional authority and control and influence over the animalistic part of the world. And to that end, Hashem says, but you cannot eat it when it is still alive. Perhaps because to that extent, only after the animal has died can you actually consume it. Because at that point, perhaps, the animal is status compared to the person, it's a dead animal. At that point, yes, it's appropriate for you to exert your status. However, while still in the live state, that is not appropriate. You're not allowed, or you're not able. That's you're not eating the animal with integrity, because you're not fundamentally on such an elevated status that you can actually consume an animal while alive. And towards the end, therefore, of man maintaining his elevated status in the world, he's a Tzalem Elokim, he represents the image of God, and therefore it has to bring to bear that authority on the world. Therefore, man has to act with respect towards the Tzalem Elokim, the image of God. Therefore, every person has to be treated with respect. And therefore, even a person, Hashem says in this context, you cannot even take your own life. I will exact a revenge from anyone who even takes their own life. Because in taking your own life, you have been pogea, you have defiled the Tzalem Elokim, the image of God. This itself will serve to undermine your elevated status as masters of the world. You've no right to even take your own life. And maybe this is part of the rationale, another additional reason perhaps why in the Torah we're allowed to eat only the pure animals. And perhaps the explanation generally offered is first of all tachuk. So the Torah says this is what the Torah has decreed, and doesn't matter what the rationale is. But nevertheless, the Meforshim and the commentaries offer a basic explanation, a straightforward, rational explanation that these animals have benign characteristics, a benign nature, more passive nature. They're not predators. Therefore, a person, you are what you eat, and if you're going to be consuming the flesh of animal predators or bird predators or fish predators, you are going to assimilate that nature, that violent nature, that predator nature within yourselves, and that's not what the Torah wants. And that's the rationale for only eating these particular type of flesh. And we can suggest an additional rationale. I started it in the last talk and I got sidetracked on other things, so I'm going to complete what I was saying here, and here's appropriate context for this. That it says, we said, Hashem took the light, created it, and then isolated it. And why is that? Does light want to be isolated? Explained why the light was isolated. Because the light was good. Hashem said the light is good, and therefore he isolated it. He said, Vayavdil. The reason being perhaps because the light would not be able to maintain its efficacy and its status and its unique properties as a light-giving entity, were it to be mishamshim biyachad im hachoshech, like Rashi says, were it to be in intermingling with the darkness, this would ultimately compromise the light's abilities. And yes, there might be certain advantages that it would also bring to bear its influence on the dark forces. However, in the interest of maintaining the integrity of the light, Hashem deemed that what's appropriate is the light has to be separated, that it can have its own unique enclave where it is able to thrive. And that is the way that holiness is preserved in the world. That's what we explained. It says regarding the animals, that's Vayavdil. Shem separated. And we explained that's part of Havdalah. That's why we separate the holy from the mundane, as the means of preserving, ensuring that the mundane does not impact negatively on the holy, does not compromise it, that all that is holy is able to maintain its complete integrity as holy, even within a mundane, secular, hedonistic, materialistic world. Nevertheless, through the dynamics of Havdalah, of separation, holiness can be preserved. And it says in the Parasha Shmini, discussing all the kosher and non-kosher animals, it says, and all the various non-kosher foods and impure foods, vivdaltem, you should distinguish between the pure and the impure animals, and that you should distinguish. And this part of the injunction of if you have certain animals and you don't know what the simonim are, you don't know what the unique identifying symbols are, identifying features of what distinguishes pure and impure. So that's vivdaltem in being proficient in the distinction between them. One can also suggest on a deeper level that's part of the hivdaltem. That is another rationale why we eat kosher animals. It's part of miluas orz v'chivshua. Initially, Adam was instructed to conquer the world, which maybe we could say means spiritually, that he should bring to bear his spiritual authority on the world, which the generation of the Mabul had failed to do. On the contrary, but that is man's commandment, to bring the Tzem Elikim, the image of Hashem, and the inspirational mode by which man appropriately conducts himself, and to infuse that into the world itself, into the materialistic world. And however, we suggested that is a task that is almost given the way the conditions, the way the world has developed, that man, there's only so much that man can do, and perhaps one has to choose where one brings one's focus. One has a class of 50 pupils, some of them are promising and some are less. So how does the teacher divide his time? Should he divide it equally to all weak and the strong, or perhaps he should focus primarily on the weak, or perhaps on the mediocre, or perhaps on the best? And there are many different approaches, and each situation perhaps demands its own unique approach. But one possible approach is, on the contrary, to focus on bringing out the best. To take the light and to preserve and enhance it, to focus one's efforts on preserving and enhancing what is already blessed and inculcated with the positive traits and holy orientation. Therefore, preserve the light. If you want to give charity, first of all, give it to the needy, the B'nai Torah. It's nice to focus on those who are far removed and to rehabilitate them, but perhaps the highest level of charity is to support the B'nai Torah, to preserve the light, to preserve and enhance the light. Maybe this is what Yisrael do. Yisrael is one nation. We also commanded, we are man, Yisrael is the representation, the true representation perhaps of man. In which case we also have the divine mission, control the world, conquer it, and inspire it. And however, as one nation, we are unable to bring to bear our influence on the whole world. Even if the son-in-law of the American president is a semi-religious Jew, that does not enable the Jews, as the protocols of Zion would suggest, to control the whole world. Far from it. And therefore the Torah, in recognizing this, says, okay, do best what you can. Maybe the Torah is telling us, okay, you can inspire and influence the world through exerting your control. How? Consuming flesh represents, to a certain extent, exerting control and authority in a forceful manner over the animalistic parts of the world, of the creation. And maybe the Torah telling us, therefore, you can eat kosher animals, is telling us where you can bring to bear your spiritual message. Focus it on those parts of the animal kingdom that will be most receptive to your message. And if you say to the pure animals, we're eating you, we're shechting you, that perhaps means that regarding that part of the creation, that the influence of Yisrael will be most felt. And that's the v'hivdaltem. Just like you do Havdalah, you separate in order to allow the preservation of the light and its enhancement. Similarly with animals, in focusing on the pure animals, and not associating with the pure animals, but over sort of figuratively, metaphorically, by consuming we are the pure animals, we are also exerting a unique authority over them, and thereby perhaps bringing to bear our influence on that part of the creation. That's perhaps a novel interpretation or a suggestion. According to this would derive from Noach. And this is maybe what Noach understood. This is the injunction to bring the pure animals. And we suggested first of all why superior number of pure animals, that they would perhaps provide an additional influence on the population of the Teva from the pure animals who conduct themselves appropriately. And ultimately, what did Noach do? He offered sacrifices. And maybe the offering of sacrifices itself. The first thing he did, he sacrificed the pure animals. Why? Because Noach's injunction, when he has landed, is first and foremost to ensure that the initiation of the world is undertaken under an appropriate spiritual regime, under the due process of spiritual inspiration emanating from Noach. And perhaps he saw the most effective way to do this. So initially he was focused perhaps on the yoina and also maybe on the pure animals. Noach said, I want at least there'll be a spiritual enclave, there'll be a unique subset of animals within the world that will be under the most the greatest influence of what Noach represents. Therefore, he said, this is maybe what Hashem intended, that he should take the sacrifices, the pure animals, and sacrifice them. And thereby, he is exerting the greatest control, greatest connection, the greatest control over this part of the creation, in the hope that this will serve to inspire, to permeate throughout. They will be the beacons of light. The pure animals, representing perhaps the more pure instincts within creation, they will emanate and inspire the throughout creation, rather than trying to rehabilitate to a greater extent those that have fallen and are less susceptible and amenable to spiritual rehabilitation and inspiration. Therefore, that is why maybe Noach took the pure animals and offered them up as sacrifice to Hashem. And in continuing that, Hashem said, okay, now I'm granting the right also to partake of the flesh of all pure animals.